Hello, and welcome to People Unfiltered, powered by Ideas Global. I'm your host, Evelyn Espinal. The People Unfiltered podcast is creating the future of inclusion, diversity, equity, activism, and social impact. We deconstruct the myths and failures of DEI, sin pelos en la lengua, to evolve it or a rebirth. We go beyond surface conversations and dive into the hard truths and unspoken realities for deeper discussions with insights and advice. Hello, Heather, and welcome to People Unfiltered. We are so excited to have you here with us to share your extraordinary story and the work of your organization. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, well, it's a great pleasure to be here, Evelyn.
I would really love it if you could share with our listeners some of the actions or tips and thoughts that you have on how to continue to do this work. I love being able to give them some practical advice from someone that's in this work day to day. Most of our listeners are leaders within their own corporations, as well as practitioners of DEI. So what are your thoughts on some practical advice that you can share?
So actually, Evelyn, in response to requests from so many of our global clients for advice, the kind of advice you're saying your people are seeking on how to respond in the face of the backlash, Symmetra published some thought leadership on this, and I'm going to talk to you about the thought leadership and the practical implications of it. We published something called the 5 Framework for building inclusive and high-performing organizations. And this framework signposts what I'd call not a revolutionary, but an evolutionary move for inclusion and diversity. You know, recognizing that this work remains critical for creating fair workplaces where everyone can thrive, but that we have to admit that some of the work in the DEI space over the last 5 to 10 years has been divisive, disempowering, ineffective, or at least at times counterproductive. So the 5 Framework provides a framework for DEI that ensures it can remain both relevant and impactful in the long term. By aligning with universal organizational objectives and ensuring an approach that is inclusive in and of itself. And I would explain all of that. It's really a toolkit for empowering each person to succeed to the best of their abilities while contributing to the success at the same time of the organization. So it's bringing that leadership and inclusion piece tightly together. So what we recommend in our 5 Framework is that every DEI practitioner starts with considering whether they are aligning themselves with with 5 implementation principles, which would be critical to their success. What we're saying is that any strategy or initiative striving to create a fair workplace where everyone can thrive and will optimize performance should be guided by these principles. In many cases, they have been absent from DEI activities, either due to a gap in strategic thinking or because we might have been focused on visibility over substance. So the principles themselves are not revolutionary. They actually describe any effective approach to a culture change initiative. So what's principle number 1? Really important that your entire approach to this work is outcomes-based, that any DEI action must have a clear outcome in mind beyond the activity itself and must be based on some theory of change, some valid scientific research showing how the activity that you want to embark on is going to support the outcome that the organization wants to achieve. The second principle is being data. Yes, sure.
Second, I love the first one.
Okay.
Our last guest that we had on the show was Christina Guthert, and she works for Reddit. She's the head of DEI and employee engagement for Reddit. And one of the things that she talked about was the importance of not being performative or emotional in doing the DEI work or in selecting the DEI practitioners, that really the work separates itself because it has to link to the bottom line of growth in the organization. And that aligns to me really perfectly with what you're saying for your principle number 1.
What Christina said is absolutely spot on. That is about being outcome based. It's aligned to the business strategic objectives. You know, again, it's going back to that early story of mine, not only a social justice issue, but a strategic business imperative.
Yes, exactly.
The second principle is data and evidence driven. The outcomes aimed for should be measurable, okay? Even if indirectly in the case of intangibles. And you should undertake actions that are proven to have impact, not just because they're perceived to be best practice or are the latest shiny thing out there that everyone is doing. So much of what is done in the DEI space is, following the trend of what everybody else is doing. It's the latest shiny thing.
Yes.
But data and evidence driven, so that you can demonstrate your impact. You can demonstrate the science behind what you're doing. This is not just soft, fluffy feelings. The third is a whole systems approach. So isolated activities like one-off trainings are often demonstrably ineffective. If you want to create real change, you have to ideally aim to tackle policy, process, technology, incentives, and behavior, all of it together. And I know that sometimes it's not feasible to do all of that, but you at least take some reasonable steps so that your efforts are not totally undermined by other aspects of the system. Right. Think about that Mandela story I referred to earlier. What would we have achieved if all we did was train the management to lead their people more effectively? And that was the big shiny thing in South Africa at the time. Equip your white leaders to work with Black employees and give them some cross-cultural understanding and understand how to motivate people who are different to them. What we had to do was address the policy, the process, the systems, not just the behavior.
I love that one as well. We had a guest, Tim Wise, and he talked about white supremacy and how it is integrated into institutionalized racism in all companies and all academic and corporate world. And he spoke about the importance of being able to dismantle a system. And as DEI practitioners, knowing the greater work that you have to do. So it's not just about delivering that training, but it is about looking at how the whole system comes together and what you would need to do to dismantle that. So that's very aligned with that objective as well.
Great. And I think the next two objectives I speak about will also be aligned with what Tim said, because the next objective is coalition building. It's about the principle of creating a win-win future that everyone wants to be a part of. We know that pro and anti-DEI activists both want to build organizations based on merit, right? But they have very different beliefs on what this looks like. But if you can start from a place of agreement that we have a shared objective and then engage in genuine debate about the methods to achieve that objective, it's possible. It is certainly possible to find compromise solutions that the majority will support. And the fifth principle, which he also addresses, is universal impact. Where possible, you must strive for outcomes that benefit everybody. This is about making your inclusion agenda inclusive in and of itself, which so many inclusion agendas for the last 5 or 10 years have not been.
Yeah.
It has to be inclusive in and of itself. Now, this has to go with, let's be realistic, this has to go with the recognition that whilst people will support universal benefits in principle, once it goes against the interests of those in a privileged position, they will naturally resist it. Hence, working together, that coalition building to reach consensus on the solutions becomes even more important. So let me now be practical and talk about implementation. What do these 5 principles mean for you as a DEI practitioner? Well, I would say using these principles, you must then apply them to each of the pillars of 5. 5 stands for F for fairness, R for inclusion, V for voice, and E for enablement. If you apply these principles to each of those pillars of 5, it will give shape to a future-proof inclusion strategy, that I'm sure of. So let's talk about the F first, for fairness. We all know fairness is about ensuring systems, processes, rewards, opportunities that are deployed in such a way that everyone has the same opportunities to learn, to develop, to grow, to excel. This means you should look at every part of the employee experience and life cycle through the lens of whether it gives equal opportunity and produces fair outcomes for all. So this practically means it could include gathering data throughout the recruitment, the development, the growth opportunity, the feedback, the promotion life cycles across all levels to identify where and whether certain obstacles may be arising. And having clear and consistent criteria, obviously, for recruitment and promotion and transparent, unbiased decision-making processes. Data is critical here. It's applying data to the fair piece because it will help identify systemic issues. I'll give you an example. We were working with an organization who was doing an excellent job in recruiting more women into the industry, but they were making very slow progress in increasing female representation in the senior ranks. The women just weren't moving up. Rather than simply putting in place a target to increase women in leadership, we sought with them to understand the root cause. We took a whole systems approach. We found there was a significant gender bias in terms of performance ratings, beginning from early career. And the solution was to revamp the performance evaluation process, look at the system, and challenge the way decisions were being made to ensure female talent were getting a fair valuation, which is an easily measurable outcome. This had substantial, downstream effects on women's career trajectory. So, what was happening is women, were not getting constructive feedback. There's all this research out there which shows you that feedback that women get is always softer and more sugar-coated. Research done by the University of Kent has demonstrated this very, very clearly. And when women don't get the clear feedback that they need, they don't know where their developmental gaps are. They don't know how to close them. How do they advance? That's just one example of the piece of research and data that we found was happening in this organization. And there were many other elements. That's the F. The R stands for inclusion. Now, we know that an inclusive culture and a workplace experience is one where everybody, regardless of their difference, feels respected, valued, and empowered. So too often, holding lots of cultural events and large-scale awareness training is seen as a good way to enhance inclusion, but neither of these would actually measure up to the 5 implementation principles. Inclusion is fundamentally an experience which arises from day-to-day experience that a person has interacting in their organization. And one-off events cannot have a meaningful, sustainable impact on this. So what we did at Symmetra was we developed a validated framework, a model, and a 360 and team-based inclusion assessment tools with the 9 distinct competencies and over 6 observable behaviors that define what inclusive behavior looks like. And that, we know, will engender a feeling of inclusion and give people a voice in an organization. So practically speaking, an effective approach to building inclusion could include way beyond the awareness raising, measuring and developing those inclusive behaviors found wanting in leaders or teams by using 360 or team-based inclusion assessments, and then doubling down on respect as a core value and ensuring a proactive build of respectful norms, rather than in so many organizations waiting to be reactive and correct acts of discrimination and harassment. And sharing tools, practically sharing tools for embedding inclusion habits into your everyday operations, embedding inclusion habits into how you communicate and how you run a team meeting and how you run a town hall and how you give constructive feedback and how you make a robust decision with a team. Embedding inclusion habits into all those moments that matter. Now, I do want to say, Evelyn, we have to be realistic here that we can't create inclusion by shaming those in a privileged position by virtue of their identity. Tackling their behaviors, if they are inappropriate or obstructive, is a different matter. You do need to tackle those, but you shouldn't be shaming them for being in a privileged position. It's not possible to build a successful coalition. This is the key thing about coalition building in establishing an inclusive culture. It's not possible to build a successful coalition for change that excludes white men or other groups in positions of power. We have to acknowledge that they too have intersectional identities and create a future vision for the organization that they feel is inclusive for them as well. And then I'll go on and talk about the V for voice. Voice means people feel they have appropriate influence, power, and input in areas that impact them and where they can add value to the organization. So voice can be direct by bringing people into forums where they can have a say and be authentically heard, but it can also be indirect, where people feel they have leaders or peers who truly understand them, take the time to listen to what they have to say and represent their interests and potential contributions. And so an effective approach to creating voice could include developing leaders who have the skill to build psychological safety and tap into all the voices in their teams, to develop leaders who are effective in communicating how people's contributions and ideas impact the end result, who understand the value of leveraging diversity of thought, in other words, to make the best decisions or to run the organization. It could also include building a culture, that values diversity of thought, innovative thinking, challenging the status quo, teaching leaders how to create productive disagreement, and an environment where people can learn from their mistakes and feel safe to fail. And I think a third piece around voice practically could be creating the formal mechanisms and the channels for people to submit their divergent ideas and to express their concerns. I think both those channels are really important. So important, so interesting. We once worked with an organization in the IT space in Asia, and the CEO wanted them to become the most successful IT business on that side of the world, and wanted to move them from about 6th place to 1st place. And the way that he achieved this was he believed that he wanted to highlight the power and lift the power of the many and diminish the power of the few. He felt that he had a set of leaders who were actually acting as a blockage to all the diversity of thought that existed in his highly diverse organization. And so he established a mechanism, a formal mechanism to allow everybody to have access to him and to have their voice heard. And so he established a crowdsourcing opportunity where he called it Help Me Solve My Problem. That was him as the CEO. Help me, the CEO, solve my problem. And he invited anybody and everybody in this organization, which employed over 10,000 people, to offer their opinions to problems that he posted on this platform. And they did not have to go via their leader or via 7 levels in order to try and get their idea heard, but they could go direct to the CEO and offer their idea on the platform. And it was phenomenal. And he attributed, much of the success of the organization, which then eventually moved to 1st place from 6th place, to this initiative. What he did was he created formal mechanisms to give voice to everyone. And you can hear that what I'm saying here, just with this example, is this is giving voice to everyone. He didn't care whether they were black or white, male or female, junior or senior, English speaking or Spanish speaking. It didn't make any difference. He was wanting to give voice to everyone. And by doing that, he was really ensuring that no one was left behind.
Yes.
It's that primary objective of optimizing performance with the secondary result that those social justice issues will be looked after as a consequence of the primary objective. And then the last thing I'll talk about is the E, enablement. So this is about the practice of equipping employees with the necessary tools, the resources, the training, and the support, everybody, to perform their jobs effectively. So this means empowering everyone equally with the things they need to contribute to the organization's success and to grow themselves while they're doing so. And so this means, again, the data piece becomes very important with enablement, because to enable people, you need to analyze all the data that you have around growth and experience. Things like who's getting the high-profile projects and clients, who's being offered the stretch projects, who's getting executive exposure, who's getting the opportunity for sponsoring and mentoring and networking, to ensure that these are being fairly distributed to all. And it also means taking what I call a many doors approach, to accessing resource and opportunities, because some people will actively seek these out and will go out and find the opportunities for themselves. But others need and receive different levels of support from their leaders to utilize them. So we have a wonderful example of this, of an organization who said that they are going to automatically opt in all high-performing women to the adverts for the internal opportunities for certain roles coming up, because they are aware of the fact that when roles are advertised internally, women will not apply for them if they don't have 100% of the skills, and will not advocate for themselves for the role, but men will apply when they've got 60%. So their solution was to automatically opt in. This was a wonderful idea about enablement. They're just being opted in. They just have to compete. And if they decide they want to withdraw, they do. But they're in essence saying you have the value, you ranked as outperforming, we want you to apply for this. And then also enablement means, getting diverse input and continuous feedback on your programs, on your initiatives to ensure that the most marginalized voices are heard and their barriers to access can be addressed. And this is really interesting because we've been working with an organization recently who the feedback, they really jacked up the feedback mechanisms they were getting. And the feedback that they got, and these were not DEI programs, these were leadership development programs. They got feedback from their people, from marginalized groups, saying intersectionality is an issue that's not being dealt with in any of our leadership development programs, and we want it in there, and these are the reasons why we need it. So I think what I've been trying to show is that by applying and focusing on fairness, inclusion, voice, and enablement, underpinned by those 5 principles that I've spoken about, would be the practical advice that I would give to any DEI practitioner operating in the current, environment across the globe around DEI.
I think that's worth its weight in gold. If I'm active practitioner of DEI right now, I'd be taking notes on everything that you just said, because it's really groundbreaking work that's driving consistency and really outcome-based results for companies. So